just war tradition, and this afternoon from a representative of the military about the law of the war and the training of military personnel. And of course, there are important symposiums yet to come tomorrow, reaching into Saturday morning. I want to say just a word tonight about the idea for this conference, where it came from, because I think it's important to register that this evening. The idea for the conference actually dates to approximately 1 year ago. As Arian said this morning, it predates certainly 9/11. But it dates to a moment when President Kerry, who will be our speaker tonight, first publicly addressed his participation in an atrocity that took place during the Vietnam War. President Kerry's revelations led to widespread and at times anguished discussion among the faculty and students at the university about what stance should be taken in response. The graduate faculty, which is hosting this conference, issued a public statement, and I would like to read sections of that statement tonight by way of setting the context for our discussion. Reading from the statement. The New School for Social Research was established in 1919. This was a time when timidity and cowardice were much in evidence. The birth of the New School for Social Research was a defiant assertion that critical inquiry could not be politically smothered. This spirit led in time to the university in exile, now of course known as the graduate faculty. Based on the rescue of scholars, the birth of the graduate faculty earned us a moral identity, one that has kept political and economic justice, human rights, the democratic rule of law, and social equality at the center of our academic project. It also led to serious reflection during time of war, as faculty and students and administration offered considered judgment on when military intervention is justified. Scholars and students from around the world have been attracted to educational programs that give prominence to such political and ethical self-examination. The present time, which is to say last spring, still reading from the statement that was adopted, the present time has placed an unexpected challenge before the tradition and mission of the New School. The university's president has acknowledged that he was responsible for an atrocity during the Vietnam War, a war for which many associated with New School University, which for many associated with New School University was considered immoral. President Kerry has forcefully declared that both as person and university president, he intends that his public acknowledgement should become reason to look hard at how little we reflect on why the young are trained to kill in the name of national interest. Many persons responded to President Kerry's statements in what could only be described as an ambiguous manner. After all, declare many, war is hell. Anyway, everyone did it. Besides, said some, if you weren't there, how can you judge? Such responses ignore the lesson of Nuremberg and subsequent international efforts that have brought the cause of accountability for violating human rights to a better place as we close out a dismal century of wartime atrocities and undeclared wars against civilian populations. Although the United States supports special tribunals for genocide in Rwanda or the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo, and applauds the truth and reconciliation efforts in South Africa or Argentina, Bob's revelations force unwelcome questions nearer home. Why has the United States failed to consider its own record in Vietnam against the standards it imposes elsewhere? Why has there been no ethical self-examination about military free fire zones and sanctioned assassination? Had there been, perhaps U.S. foreign policy elsewhere, in Guatemala or Chile, for example, would have been less complicit in human rights violations. Perhaps there would be less public acceptance of foreign policy more intent on protecting America's economic interest than on advancing international standards of justice and equity. The statement then concludes with a resolution to the effect that the graduate faculty will examine the use of America's unprecedented power against the legitimate claims of international human rights and economic justice. This conference was planned in that spirit and in direct response to President Kerry's call for the university to turn his revelations into, as he stated very well at the time, an educational moment. Since that call, and in the midst of the planning for this conference, of course, 9/11 brought a new urgency and a new dimension to this educational obligation. It is my privilege then to introduce President Kerry, President of New School University, who will share with us his perspective on terrorism, globalism, and the cause of international justice. Join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. Dean Pruitt, I also want to thank Arian Mack, who originally brought the idea for the conference to me and asked me to do two things. One was to speak, which I've said yes to, and the other was to get Dick Holbrook, and Dick participated in the first, Ambassador Holbrook participated in the first conference. Aaron, congratulations on continuing a series of successes with these conferences. And I appreciate very much the work that you did to bring all the participants here. I also want to welcome all participants that have come, many who have come from throughout the world to attend this conference, and we welcome you to New School University. I appreciate very much the introduction and the reference to the graduate faculty's public statement. I take it as a good sign that it was not a public demand. I've been receiving more of those lately than I would like, but I appreciate very much the spirit in which this public statement is made and engage, hopefully, in a constructive fashion as well. The graduate faculty, formerly known as the New School of Social Research, is one of 8 divisions and programs at our university. And it has long been a place where controversial, where complex, and even dangerous ideas can be discussed openly without fear of anything other than having your opinion vigorously challenged. We are a school where arguments are encouraged because we know there are answers to the great social questions of the day, even if we don't know what those answers are. And we are a place where arguments are encouraged even if they make us uncomfortable. Indeed, it might be said that we prefer arguments that make us uncomfortable. The topics that are brought before us over the course of the 3 days of this conference, international justice, war crimes, and terrorism, are among the most important and difficult that mankind faces in the 21st century. They are also ones that make us uncomfortable precisely because they are often ethically ambiguous. The September 11th suicide mass murders that have focused American minds on the random, immoral, and destructive violence of terrorism was not ethically ambiguous. And as a result, it moved the question of how to prevent such attacks to the top of our domestic and our foreign policy agendas. The solutions, however, are not as obvious as we wish, and they will not be found merely in painful re-examinations of U.S. actions in the past. When I said I hoped to turn my revelations last spring into an educational moment, I did not intend to meekly submit to cross-examinations or self-indulgent one-sided criticism of U.S. foreign policy during the war in Vietnam. Open and honest evaluations of America's conduct during that war and other wars has led to a substantial improvement in our military training and in our behavior, as well as our attitude towards getting involved in the affairs of others. For 30 years, when the phrase "getting over Vietnam" was used in foreign or military circles, it was referencing unwarranted caution, not exuberant aggressiveness and overconfidence. In any discussion about America's conduct in wars, it is best to remember our tendency to withdraw from the world, especially after a terrible military experience. We withdrew from the world after experiencing the horror and slaughter of the first great war of the 20th century. We stacked our arms, downsized our military, and attempted to return to normal. We refused to ratify the treaty creating the League of Nations. we enacted restrictive, racist immigration laws. The Great War may not have been the war to end all wars, but Americans were unambiguously and ethically determined that it would be the last European war with which we were involved. When the National Socialist Party came to power in Germany on January 31st, 1933, the head of this university, Alvin Johnson, knew that intellectuals, and Jewish intellectuals in particular, were in trouble. He began an effort to raise money to provide a refuge, a university in exile, that became one of the great moral acts in the history of American higher education. And lest we forget it, it was not a decision fully embraced by American public opinion that continued to steadfastly resist getting involved. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not promise to take America to the side of freedom in the 1940 presidential campaign. Quite the contrary. He had to resort to lend-lease to provide assistance. It was not until we were attacked on December 7th, 1941, and Germany declared war on us that we mobilized and entered the conflict. After the Second World War, the American people chose a more international course. The United Nations, the Bretton Woods Agreements, NATO, the Marshall Plan stand as monuments to our understanding how the world's peace and security depended upon our not yielding to isolationist impulses. Still, we slashed our defense spending and were able to provide relief to Europe only because of presidential determination and the reputation of George Marshall. We certainly did not send billions to rebuild those war-shattered lands because of overwhelming public support. As a child, I remember in Lincoln, Nebraska, very angry sentiment against this effort. The Korean War was an even more striking example of what can happen when the United States disengages following a terrible and bloody war. North Korea's invasion of South Korea occurred after we withdrew the 7th Army from the peninsula, and after our Secretary of State indicated that South Korea was not in our strategic interest. Even after the invasion, President Truman did not have enough public support for the war to be able to go to Congress and ask for either a declaration of war or for a law enabling involuntary conscription. Public support for that war evaporated in short order, along with Truman's chances for re-election. No doubt this memory contributed to our unwillingness to act to prevent Soviet troops from entering Hungary in 1955. I cite this history at the beginning of my talk because Americans have not always covered themselves in glory during the great ethical challenge of the past, not just in the way it has conducted itself in war, but how it has conducted itself in avoiding war. Proudly citing our superiority in opposing some specific war encourages us to forget how our ethical preference for pacifism and neutrality in 1938, in 1939, and 1940 became the greatest of all ethical disasters. In the panel on the concept of a just and therefore legal war that was conducted this morning, we've been reminded how difficult and how important it is to morally justify what must be done in any war, even one that is fought by combatants who follow the Geneva Convention to the letter. To wage a war, we must train our youth to use violent and deadly means to defeat an enemy force that has been organized against it. Killing is the business of war, and I doubt there's ever been a war where both sides were not capable of making the ethical case that the killing was the only choice available to them. And for me, few things darken my mind more quickly than listening to two sides to a war explain why their cause is just and moral as the death toll continues to mount. But if the United States is to use its considerable power for good, we must be capable of understanding what war itself can be ethically justified. In the panel on the training of the military, you've heard detailed explanations of what national governments do to make certain their soldiers do not violate domestic laws that have been written to implement international treaties. Few things are more difficult than to bring the calm, reasoned approach of the classroom into the irrational, blood-stained environment of the battlefield. Tomorrow you will hear from a distinguished panel which will help us understand the founding arguments and rationale for international tribunals and their use today and their potential with the newly created International Criminal Court. Few things are more confusing than to be reminded that a judicial process I oppose and condemn today is a process I have supported in the past when it suited my political purposes. All of these and more will lead us to the question of how to define and how to respond to terrorism, with the hope that some ideas will emerge to guide us into a future where terrorism and crimes against humanity become rarer and rarer. It is always our hope that our arguments will produce greater clarity and greater willingness to run the risks that are always associated with holding controversial political positions. To begin the argument, I would like to express my opinion that we must take care not to tilt too much in the direction of using national and international tribunals as a remedy for war crimes. We should also pay attention to the value of using military efforts to deter, defend against, or to stop the violence of large-scale atrocities like ethnic cleansing and genocide. While clear and certain penalties can deter crimes by soldiers in most modern nation-states, they will have considerably less impact in places where the idea of the nation-state seems like fantasy or where corrupt religious belief has led people to believe that suicide murders are a pathway to salvation. A well-trained and deadly military committed to conducting war according to the specific requirements of the Geneva Convention can prevent crimes against humanity. Few should doubt the fate of Kurds and Shia who live north and south of Iraq's 38th and 35th parallel, without the almost daily missions being flown by United States and British pilots and their crews. And few should doubt that the intervention by the United States and NATO in Bosnia and Kosovo had the effect of ending ethnic cleansing and setting up an international tribunal against Slobodan Milosevic. Few should have any qualms about concluding that our unwillingness to intervene with a military force in Rwanda was responsible for permitting one of the 20th century's greatest crimes to take place. And few should doubt that military intervention in Afghanistan has substantially weakened the capacity of those who perpetrated the crime against the United States and the free world on September 13th, and just as importantly, liberated the people of Afghanistan from the terror of their own government, giving them hope that peace may be returning once and for all. Giving hope to those who are without hope does not just mean demonstrating a willingness to intervene with our military. It means we must be willing to help do the risky, the messy, and never perfect work of building stable democracies with market economies. It means we must be willing to transfer some of our wealth and some of our credit, especially in those cases where political leaders have demonstrated the courage and the will to end the debilitating practices of corruption. It means the developed world must keep our trade policies open so the developing world has a chance of selling into our markets, as well as a fighting chance of getting a fair resolution of trade conflicts at the World Trade Organization. It means we cannot withdraw from the world because we fail or are not perfect. At the same time, we must understand and acknowledge the risks that come with our leadership and our involvement. Taking sides in bitter domestic disputes provokes opposition. Osama bin Laden's initial anger towards the United States comes from our decision to leave troops in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War as a deterrent against the possibility that Saddam Hussein might become an aggressor state once again. To us, this is a reasonable and necessary thing to do. However, to the Muslim believer, we are infidels who desecrate the holy places of Mecca and Medina. To the Muslim believer, killing Americans is a reasonable and necessary thing to do. I do not bring moral relativism to this analysis. I believe the presence of U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia has helped stabilize the region. I do not believe radical Islamicists are justified in their killing. The point I seek to make is simply that the will to intervene to reduce the threat or the fact of crimes against humanity is often inversely correlated with the perceived risks associated with the intervention. These risks include the financial cost, the human cost, and the potential for having history judge your actions harshly. Before I move to offer a short list of what I believe the world community must do to deal with terrorism and war crimes, allow me to present a second controversial opinion. I believe the singularity of U.S. military supremacy is a very good thing for those of us who want the world to become a more peaceful and prosperous place. And I believe it is a very good thing for those of us who want the world to become a more just place as well. And critics, in my view, have it wrong when they express concern that this supremacy makes us overeager to deploy our forces in the world. Critics should be just as concerned about the opposite. They should worry that the risk assessment done by U.S. presidents and members of Congress before authorizing the deployment of any of our armed forces will cause us to disengage and do less. And those of you who are here to hear Ambassador Holbrooke talk about Bosnia in 1995 should understand that this is true. 2/3 of the House of Representatives voted against an authorization to send American forces to Bosnia. By a bare majority, the Senate supported. The President did not get permission from the People's Congress to participate in the NATO operation. And by all judgments, the NATO operation has ended the ethnic cleansing and violence in Bosnia, not without a considerable controversy and not with the support of the People's Congress. I offer as well the current effort on the war and terrorism as a case in point. The primary energy driving our deployment of force is self-defense and threat reduction. Now, self-defense and threat reduction are understandable and justified bases for military action. But self-preservation is an instinct that is nowhere near as noble and worthy as its opposite, being willing to risk your life for someone else. And it is obviously a self-limiting effort. At some point, the cause becomes too self-indulgent to sustain. In the current case, I'm personally appalled at the extremes to which President Bush and Congress are willing to go in order to make us feel safer in the United States of America. Total spending increases on defense and homeland security between last year and this will total $80 billion. And I would personally feel safer if they converted the $80 billion into $1,000 bills and threw it out the window than I do on the spending that's being proposed. Along with last year's tax cuts, also proposed to Americans as a way to help them, this new spending will guarantee that the United States does not have the resources or the will to make the investments needed to close the widening gap between the world's haves and the world's have-nots, or to make necessary investments in the health and education of our own people. My recommended agenda for dealing with the problem of international justice and war crimes has 4 parts. First, we will need a strong military force, multinational where possible and unilateral where necessary, to signal to international outlaws that we will not waver if they threaten the open, secular, tolerant, and multi-ethnic societies that are such a threat to them. Second, we need better training of our own forces in both the existing rules of war and the dire consequences of violating those rules. Third, we will need a doubling or even tripling of our foreign assistance combined with more liberalization of our trade policies. And fourth, we will need the International Criminal Court in which the United States participates fully. Let me briefly add some additional detail to all 4 of these items. First, the need for strong and effective military force. Here, as I sense from some squirming in the audience, the most difficult issue is the fact of U.S. supremacy. It is an unpleasant truth to some in the free world, but it is a truth nonetheless. The successful intervention in Bosnia would simply not have been possible without U.S. leadership. and participation in the diplomatic, intelligence, and military effort. Kosovo is the same way, where as long as the effort was under the control of the United Nations, we witnessed the horror of ethnic cleansing and the slaughter of innocents. As soon as the United States put its weight behind a NATO intervention, the balance began to swing to peace. A more painful example for Americans is Rwanda. Only the United States is blamed for not intervening to stop the genocide because the world knew that only the United States had the capability of getting the job done. That we did nothing will make us feel shame for as long as our nation survives with a memory worth praising. No other people on earth carries such a burden. In the war against the al-Qaeda network in Afghanistan and around the world, the United States has taken the lead. It is justified and necessary that we do so, because those who have declared war on liberal democracy and who enthusiastically embrace the use of attacks on civilian population attack the United States for a reason. We are the house of war. We are the #1 enemy, not because of our policies in the Middle East or our support for Israel. We are target #1 because of our economic, our political, and our military success. If we were in second place, someone else would be the primary target for this violence. The issue of what justifies the use of military force is nonetheless of primary importance. To illustrate my views, I will offer 2 examples that are my opinions only. I could not justify either the cost or the killing in Afghanistan on the basis of self-defense or threat reduction alone. I can justify the action when the outcome is the removal of the repressive Taliban from power if the United States and our allies make the military and economic commitment to stay the course until a stable and peaceful nation-state exists. Likewise in Iraq, I am not convinced that military intervention is justified in order to reduce the threat of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. On the other hand, I would support military intervention if the objective was the liberation of 25 million Iraqis and the assistance needed to establish a democratic Arab government. Second on my agenda, there is a need for honest and open evaluation of not only our military training, but the military training of the free world as well, especially in those times when force structure is increased rapidly. I come to this issue with considerable personal experience and believe it is not enough to simply give our soldiers a card telling them about the rules of war, which became U.S. law after we ratified the '49 Geneva Convention. Nor is it enough to selectively prosecute offenders. If we expect the law to be enforced fairly and justly, we must provide every serviceman and woman with a thorough education and training about the details of the law and, most importantly, of the consequences of what could happen to them if they violate this law. Otherwise, politics and circumstance will determine who is prosecuted and who is not. In this area, there is considerably more risk for the United States military personnel than for armed services of other nations, and for all the reasons cited earlier. And I urge, especially those of you who support the International Criminal Court, those of you who support it and wonder why the Senate of the United States at the moment would not ratify, you must understand that it's true. We are much more exposed than other nations will be exposed. When the United States soldier breaks a law, it is much more likely to become an international incident than when the soldier of any other nation does the same. And unless and until some other free nation becomes the world's preeminent military power, the sons and daughters of U.S. families will be called on more often to put their lives and their characters on the line. Still, the United States must lead on this issue by setting an example, just as we must with other dangers, such as weapons of mass destruction, the spread of AIDS, and global climate change. Third, the level of international aid and less than open trade policy of the United States and the European Union fall appallingly short of what is needed to give us cause to say we are doing all that we are capable of doing. To be clear, I do not believe that economic progress on its own will end the threat posed by terrorism. There is increasing radicalism amongst Muslims in Singapore in spite of per capita income of $29,000 a year. And dare I use the example, Timothy McVeigh's murderous act was not caused by economic disparities. Still, well, where there is no economic or political hope, there is unquestionably a greater potential that violent means will be used to achieve political objectives. So that the United States simply cannot afford not to spend more of our income to help the developing world. And we cannot afford protectionist trade policies, which make it next to impossible for them to export to two of the largest consumer markets, the United States and Europe. We should condition economic assistance on political reform and the elimination of the kind of corruption seen in Nigeria and Angola. We should use non-governmental organizations who can help struggling democracy write good laws and build the structures of civil society that are the glue that hold democracies together. However, we here in the United States cannot allow the need for political reform and capacity building to become an argument against further material help. Very closely associated with this issue of increased aid and trade are the issues of immigration, and I will state briefly our own domestic drug policies. Anti-immigrant impulses in the developed world are dangerous, they are counterproductive, and they must be resisted. The economic and social success of New York City is the best argument in favor of liberal immigration laws that work to reduce the burden and paperwork placed on those who seek economic opportunities. No military, aid, or trade policies will succeed if we allow those who talk about immigration as a danger to win that argument. The connection, as I indicated briefly, between terrorism and drug policy, though less obvious, I just wanted to score the point and say to you, though I will add no further details, I am strongly convinced that our domestic drug policies add to the violence in places like Colombia. Fourth, the United States Senate should ratify the treaty creating the International Criminal Court so that the United States can participate fully in its establishment and operation. I know there are sincere arguments against, and again, I urge you to remember that more than a majority of senators today would not vote for this treaty. And they would not vote for it because they are concerned at the potential damage and harm in a political environment to U.S. military forces from politically motivated accusations. Once again, that comes with the territory being the world's leading military power. Failure to ratify this treaty will mean that our military personnel and elected political leaders will have no power but refusal to cooperate to make certain that proper safeguards and sanctions are placed on individuals and organizations who make unsubstantiated charges. Citizens who debate this issue should remember one simple fact about treaties in the United States of America. They are not permanent. If it doesn't work and you don't like it, we can withdraw at some point in the future. Not likely that would be required in my view, but we need not fear that we're writing something permanent here that we can never reverse. I would say honestly and with great respect for Secretary General Kofi Annan and others who have said that politics will play no role in the court's deliberation, that is not a persuasive argument. In open, democratic societies, politics almost always plays a role in the process of justice. We wish it were not so, but it's true. And anyone that spent much time inside of our judicial system has to reach that conclusion. Work to try to change it, work to try to make it not so, but it is regrettably the truth. I would respectfully urge those who try to offer guarantees of a politics-free ICC to stop making this argument lest they persuade supporters such as myself to change our minds. I would likewise encourage supporters of the ICC to openly criticize and condemn individuals and organizations who use the new court to score political points. Failure to do so could have a terribly negative impact on the safety and security of the free world. I choose to make one more controversial suggestion at the close of my remarks. The possibility of being accused of war crimes will unquestionably deter some military actions that we would prefer to see happen. I've heard some proponents of the ICC say they hope this happens. They express the hope that political leaders, especially American political leaders, become far less willing to authorize the use of force. To that, I merely urge you to read the 50-plus page declaration of war issued in 1996 by Osama bin Laden. He counted on the United States being unwilling to run the risk. And a lot of people died because he believed we would do nothing. Before I conclude and take your questions, I want to thank again Dean Pruitt, and I want to thank Arian Mack for organizing this conference. I thank all those who have agreed to participate in our panels, and I thank all of you for your willingness to attend. I sincerely hope the discussion of these 3 days will contribute to making our world safer, our world more secure, and our world more just. Thank you very much.
May I very quickly remind you of the rules we like to observe during the question period. Come to the mics. Obviously, we'd like not more than 3 or 4 people to congregate at the mic at any one time. You'll have your chance to ask the questions. And we really urge you to observe the time limit of just 2.5 minutes to form your question. And we also hope it's a question. Please.
Thank you. I've always had great respect for your candor and straightforwardness, sir. You mentioned the singularity of American power in this period. Some would argue, or make the argument, that part of the reaction that we see in the Middle East and throughout the Muslim world in the past few years, and certainly in the past few weeks, is a perception on the part of the masses in the Muslim world of their idea that we are, in fact, engaged in war crimes with the sanctions policy and the, whatever the body count of dead in Iraq is, that's how they are perceiving it. And I wanted to get your opinion on that particular question about the consequences of our actions, and secondly, related to the Vietnam War. At the time of the trials of Lieutenant Calley and the other members of that particular unit that were involved in the incident, if you recall, most of the public was in favor of them being exonerated. And if I recall, the public opinion polls were very high. They felt they were being scapegoated, et cetera. And I wanted to get your opinion from your perspective about how you view that process in retrospect and how it resonates today with us thinking about these issues.
Well, as to the first part, you've asked me a question that's going to require considerably more time than the other questioners would perhaps like me to take, but I'll run that risk at the moment. As to the first question, the appearance that the United States is, to use your phrase, I think, guilty of war crimes for sanctions in Iraq.
Well, that's not my phrase. That's the phrase that's being put about by some of the
Well, look, I think part of the problem is that we've been far too tolerant of Arab governments who violate the human rights of their own people. We need the oil. Saudi Arabia can pull it out of the ground for $1 a barrel. So we need the oil. And so we tolerate the abuse of their own people. We tolerated Iraq's abuse of their own people. We tolerated even Syria. We said, well, Hamas, understandable. That's an Arab government. They deal with their people differently. Likewise, in other nations, we tolerate things that we shouldn't have tolerated. But I do think that that Muslim leaders more than I are going to have to address a serious problem in their religion. It's a serious problem. I'll state it this way. I'm sometimes practicing Christian. So if I wanted to stand before you today and tell you a couple of Jesus jokes, if I wanted to tell you that I didn't think the Bible was an accurate document, or that Christ himself wasn't really a historical character, I could say that without fear of having a fatwa put out on me. If I was a Jewish comedian, I could stand up and tell a couple of Moses jokes and get away with it. Indeed, great debates going on about the Torah all the time. There's been no Reformation in the Muslim world, and it's a huge problem. I mean, if you examine the details of Christian belief and Muslim belief, they're very, very similar in 2 very important ways, but very different in 1 important way. The similarity is they both believe they're right and everybody else is wrong. Similarity number 2 is they believe in converting, going out, being called. We call it missionaries in the Christian faith. They call it jihad in the Muslim faith. So they're very similar in that way and very much in conflict, except that Christianity had a Reformation, a bloody Reformation, that lasted hundreds of years. And we got through it and are much more tolerant. We're at our worst when we're not tolerant. When we say, if you don't believe the Bible literally and so forth, you're going to hell. And some in my Christian faith believe that. So I think it's a great challenge, and I don't think you can ignore it. Because if you ignore it, you tolerate and allow people to organize and do terrible things to other human beings. And you say, well, and you rationalize it and say, well, it's because we're doing this or they're doing that or something. And it's bad to rationalize it. We wouldn't rationalize it here in the United States, if there was, and don't, in fact. You saw Governor Bush backpedaling like mad after he gave a speech at Bob Jones University, and that was based upon things that Bob Jones University used to do that are nowhere near as extreme and dangerous as many madrasas that are supported by Saudi Arabia and others. So I mean, there's a fundamental problem that we got to face, and political correctness in this case are going to get in trouble. I don't want to offend my Muslim friends. I don't want to sound like I'm anti-Muslim, but it's a fact and it's true, and it's got to be addressed. And only Muslim leaders, in my view, can deal with it. As to the second, first of all, I wasn't aware of what public opinion polls were. I'm very much aware of the Cali trial. And I wouldn't go so far as to say it was scapegoating, but as I tried to imply in my remarks, I wasn't even given a Geneva Convention card, as many infantry officers and enlisted people were. Certainly never talked about the Geneva Convention in any of my training, other than to be told what would happen to me if I was a prisoner. Name, rank, and serial number. Everybody knows that's made its way into popular culture, made its way into military culture as well. And the first time that I have examined in detail the laws relating to military behavior is relatively recently, in a time of war. So that's why I put so much emphasis. And the statement that I made is, if it's not taught what the consequences are, here's what's going to happen to you. Here's the exact code, and here's what it is, and here are the consequences of violating that code. And make sure you understand that we're going to enforce this law, and we're going to enforce it uniformly, and we're going to enforce it fairly. If that doesn't happen, then politics and circumstances determine what happens. And in a lot of ways, what happened to Cali was politics and circumstances, in my view, given what was going on in our own training. I've never said the things that Ken said other people have said about my own incident in Vietnam, that it was war, nor did I ever say that everybody did it. That's not an argument I would ever make in defense, nor would I offer any argument in defense of what I did. But it is unarguably true that we received nowhere near the kind of training necessary to prepare people for the consequences of violating those laws. Yes, sir.
Hi. Samuel Song. Certainly, United States is a pioneer in human rights diplomacy and human rights policy. However, some countries like China, North Korea, some other nations do not respect U.S. foreign policy regarding human rights issues. But I have some concerns about that. If United States pursues human rights policy, it should be persistent, fair, based on the truth and the justice. But I have some concerns about this. For example, as you might recall, San Francisco Treaty of 1952, bilateral treaty, United States and Japan. According to Japan's claim that all World War II crimes committed by Japanese completely released after by the San Francisco Treaty. That is a bilateral treaty, US and Japan, excluding then allies such as Russia and China. Having said that, Japan, even if international court was held in Tokyo 2 years ago, condemning Japan for the atrocities and probably worst war crimes in human history. I can send you, if you don't agree with me, worst. And such data, I do have it. Having said that, United States does not bring Japan to the stage of forcing or recommending reasonable action against its crimes, as like the great nation Deutschland. Deutschland did it. Yeah, Deutschland did it, and in Europe, because of Deutschland's full apology, reasonable reparations. Okay. All right, thanks. Peace has been continued in Europe, but because of what is your response and your notions about United States double standard of human rights policy in this case, in point?
Well, first, I'm not as familiar as I perhaps should be about all the details of either the San Francisco agreement that you cited, or I am familiar with some of the other things you talked about. Well, look, I mean, certain at the beginning that it's a rare person that doesn't have a double standard on human rights. And I say that because I think double standard. We should try not to be hypocritical. We should try not to apply double standards. We should not try to have one standard of justice for one person, another standard of justice for ourselves. But it's a part of human nature. I read a book not too long ago called The Emperor's General, discussing the United States decision to basically say we need the emperor to survive. We can't try him as a war criminal. And as a consequence of that, we're going to try other people because we need the emperor and the emperor's authority to be able to. I have no idea if it's a legitimate claim, this book, but I happen to know the author and I trust him. So let's presume that it is. It's just one of many examples. Yes, I mean we have an embargo on Cuba. I didn't vote for it, but we have an embargo on Cuba, and we have no such embargo. We have most favored trading status with China. That has, I think, by almost every argument, worse human rights policies than Cuba does. So, yeah, I mean, the problem oftentimes, unfortunately, becomes in these things. I've got some personal interest, and too often that personal interest, cut to the chase, ends up being money. And I need cheap oil, and so I'll turn my head and ignore what Saudi Arabia is doing internally. I need to be able to find an easy place to manufacture my textiles or whatever, and so it's jobs and money, and so I'll turn my head and hope for the best. So, yeah, I think that. I think, on the other hand, we should not be discouraged by the fact that we discover double standards. I think we should be encouraged when we find the standards high almost under any circumstances, and pursue those higher standards, and try to establish them. And that's why, in my view, the International Criminal Court is something the United States should ratify and fully participate in. Is it perfect? No. What is? It's rare that you can find a court in the United States that you would ever consider to be perfect. I was talking about the death penalty with a friend of mine, and I think it was George Will that said, as soon as the IRS stops making mistakes, I'll support the death penalty. So it's rare that you find a situation where perfection occurs, but I just think our best and highest instincts, we have to follow them and not be discouraged when we find ourselves being hypocritical or having double standards. Try to minimize them.
Can we go to the other side? And let me remind you, we really just want questions.
Yeah, my name is Jeff Hawks. I'm in the political science department at the University of Connecticut. You make a persuasive case for why the United States should be using its military, political, and economic power to push for reform that would increase the stability of the world. And I'm curious as to how you would respond to the critics who say it is precisely this use of our power that angers the world, that we go into places in the world where, yes, they want stability, and yes, they want economic growth, but not at the expense of sacrificing their own political culture. That they have a long history and tradition of political institutions that are not consistent with the democratic reforms we would like to see, And through these actions, we're actually decreasing our popularity, our credibility, and our security.
I think it's moral relativism at its worst. I think it presumes that we're somehow superior beings and only we prefer freedom and the rest of the world doesn't. I don't think it's a Western idea. I think it's a universal idea. I've heard people say, for example, in Iraq, that you don't understand, democracy is not possible there. Well, there's a lot of Arab Americans who make democracy work every election. They weren't transformed as a consequence of being citizens. They understand how to make the system work. They're learning how to make the system work, and they make the system work. So I think it's at best moral relativism. At worst, it's racism. To presume that somebody else can't do the difficult work of making democracy work. And secondly, I would say, go to Seoul. Go to Sarajevo. Go to Belgrade. Go to places where, peace and security have been established, and there was significant prediction. First of all, in Bosnia, that the Americans were going to suffer great losses, so we didn't want to go. That we're going to get entangled. I mean, the argument was, this has been going on for centuries. They're all going all the way back to the Battle of Kosovo, and the argument was nobody holds a grudge like a Serb, and they're going to keep going on for centuries, and all we're going to do is make it worse. We didn't make it worse. You can fly to. I was there in August of 1995 when a 120-millimeter rocket slammed into a cafe in Sarajevo and killed 85 people who were sitting out there on the sidewalk on a Saturday afternoon enjoying the sun. You couldn't get into Sarajevo. There were American State Department personnel who died trying to get in there. You can fly there today and shop if you want to. So I would just offer, Exhibit A. Talk to men who have gone back to Normandy, who happened to be there, who ran the risk of D-Day on the 6th of June, 1944, who had no promise of military veterans benefits or anything. Go talk to the people of France. Go talk to the people in the lowlands country. Go talk to people who have benefited from our intervention. It's not perfect. And God knows we did it wrong in Central America, and God knows we make lots of mistakes, and God knows there's times when we're so superior and full of ourselves that we piss off half the world. But we sometimes get it right. And to withdraw because we make mistakes, to become isolationists because we fail, I just think the arguments are overwhelmingly against that understandable and sometimes even ethical instinct. Yes, sir.
My name is Benjamin Ferenz. I was a prosecutor at the Nuremberg war crimes trials, and I was also a soldier with General Patton's army from the beaches of Normandy to the Battle of the Bulge. I was a war crimes investigator during the war. I saw the atrocities in the concentration camps at first hand, and I appreciate your observations, President Kerry, about the need for more social justice in the world. I'm grateful for your candor and also for your express support for the International Criminal Court, to which I've dedicated about 50 years of my life, and I'm happy to say that it is now coming into existence. I'm unhappy that the United States is not a part of it. My question is this. At Nuremberg, the United States stood for certain legal propositions. One was that the law which we lay down has to apply to everyone, including ourselves. We do not assert the rule of law belongs only to us to decide, but it must be applied equally. If we demand a right of intervention, we can expect that others will demand a right of intervention, and it will be hard to persuade them that they should not have the same rights. That's been the problem with the court. We have tried to get an exemption for U.S. personnel under all circumstances, partly for the reasons that you gave. You fear there may be corruption in the courts, as there are corruption in all courts. But we have two very distinguished judges sitting in this audience here, Judge Wald and Judge Goldstone, who are experienced in this field and who have come out very strongly in favor of this International Criminal Court, despite those concerns. The American Bar Association has come out in favor of it, a very conservative organization. 10 presidents of the former American Society of International Law, have come out strongly in favor of this court. And yet you said, let's not try to change your mind.
No, I did not apologize, sir. I did not say that. I said only that you have, if you're going to try to change someone's mind, you do have to identify fears or arguments that they have that have some rational basis.
Well, I'm glad to have that correction of that because, of course, we have fears. Of course, this is an imperfect child. It's a newborn babe. But we've got to believe in the rule of law. And the question is, if you believe in the rule of law, as I hope you do, then don't you think that we should move to improve the rule of law in connection with intervention as well, so that we act in accordance with the approved rules, not in defiance of the rules which we set up, such as disregarding the Security Council? I realize it's merit at times, and I'm certainly not a pacifist. I have 5 battle stars to prove it. But I think that we would welcome some clarification as to how you expect the United States to assume its proper leadership role in supporting this court.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy that you've survived for the past 50 years.
Yes.
And are among
Yes.
us. And I'm very pleased that you fought this fight, and I'm very pleased that you're able to see it come to fruition. And what I think, in general terms, that what one has to do when you're trying to persuade somebody to change their mind is a couple of things. First, in some cases, the mind is unchangeable. I mean, for example, the original co-sponsor of the American Serviceman Protection Act, Tom DeLay, has an unchangeable mind. So, Congressman DeLay, I'm sure you're a fine citizen and a wonderful parent and so forth, but I'm not going to argue with you, because no matter what I do, he's going to hold that opinion. I'm not going to change his mind. But there are others who are reasonably concerned. And what they express is a concern that says, number one, the United States is more exposed, both because of our primacy and because oftentimes we're not intervening because we want to, we're intervening because we ask. I mean, we didn't intervene in Rwanda, and we weren't asked to intervene in Rwanda. And it was a horrible tragedy. Sierra Leone was very similar. We wouldn't even send a helicopter to Sierra Leone because we were concerned. The president was concerned about the potential negative impact, I think, on the vice president in a campaign against Governor Bush, who was arguing that nation-state building can't be done and shouldn't be the role of the United States government, was winning the argument. In part, in my opinion, because the vice president wasn't responding, to show the examples of where nation-state building has worked. So I think we just simply have to acknowledge that the fear is legitimate, but the consequences of our not cooperating, the consequences of our saying all we're going to do is deny your access to intelligence and deny your access to us, and we're just going to basically say, hell no, we won't go, are worse for American forces. It's worse for the causes that we care deeply about. It's not going to benefit us in the end. It's one of those situations, I don't know if you never have done or know anybody that's never done any rock climbing, but when you do rock climbing and you lose your grip, your body says flatten out against the rock. And if you do, you're dead. If you're up very high, you're at least going to get your knees and your face and upper body skinned up pretty good. That's the wrong thing to do. You got to do the opposite of what your instincts tell you to do. And I think we're in a very similar situation. The instinct says, I think we're more exposed, I think we have more risk, and thus we shouldn't participate. But it's wrong. We're more exposed if we don't participate. We're less capable of being able to do the things that the United States of America, at its best, wants to do. I do not think it exposes our soldiers more than they're exposed right now in an environment where there's a tendency of us to enforce our laws more than other nations do and be more concerned about it. So I would try to give a respectful argument and acknowledge that politics are part of the justice system from time to time, acknowledge that they're risk, but the final argument, in my view, in favor of the ICC is that the fear that our forces are going to be more exposed is wrong. They're going to be more exposed if we don't participate than they would be if we continued to say, basically, hell no, we won't go. Intervention is never perfect, and I mean, as I said, I vastly prefer it to be multinational. But there are times that it doesn't work. Just doesn't work. Sometimes you can't even get the Congress to support it, as I said in Bosnia, in the case of Bosnia. And so, I mean, the one thing that from 12 years of experience in the United States Senate that I just urge upon those of you who believe otherwise to believe is so, when it comes time to use American force, there is, I believe, an overestimation of risk. The military will do it because they know. They still got the Vietnam syndrome in many ways. They know what it's like to get hung out there and then have the support pulled away. And so they're always saying, here's the potential risk, here's the potential risk, here's the potential cost, and they generally overstate it, as they should. During the Vietnam War, they did just the opposite, and they were derelict in their duty as a consequence. So I mean, as I said, I'd vastly prefer to have it be multinational, and most important for me, regardless of whether it's multinational or unilateral, the best motivation for us is not protecting us, but liberating other people and staying the course and being willing to do the hard part of trying to make, and build democratic institutions in spite of people saying it can't be done. I mean, there was so many people saying that Dayton would fail. And has it got flaws? Yes. Are there defects in it? Yes. You can criticize it and find all sorts of things to say that this is wrong and bad, but you can fly to Sarajevo and shop. And there hasn't been a single NATO casualty, not a single one, since the takeover authority in December of 1995.
Yeah, my name's Harold Channer. I do cable television programming in New York. And Tom Foley once famously observed that all politics is local. I've heard some people take that and turn it on its ear in a certain sense and say all politics is economic. It is that there's an economic component to all of the outreach and this process of globalization that you referred to. That you referred to as part of the title of your speech. I just watched a program that was on public television last year with Mr. Yergin and so forth called Commanding Heights. I don't know how many of you had a chance to see that. But they were discussing it was a 6-hour, very well-produced documentary on the rationale and economic theory and so forth behind and the implications of the globalization process as an economic development. And we had Jeffrey Sachs, for instance, some of these people, developmental economists. And one of the things that was particularly upsetting, at least in terms of what was presented in the program, was that there was an assumption on the part of many of the people there. Jeffrey Sachs, there were representatives of
Sir, could I remind you that this morning we heard a lot about your program. We appreciate it, but we really want to get to a question and not the the background of the people we've been talking to.
All right, very good. All right. They said that there was a problem, and they brought up these people, young people by and large, the anti-globalization movement that happened in Seattle, the thing in Quebec, the thing in Genoa, and that there were these young people, by and large, or people that were criticizing the process and the system and the theory behind the globalization itself as one that is intrinsically benefiting plutocratic ownership elements around the country, including our own, rather than uplifting the people in a long-term prospect. And they said, they seemed even
thank you. I'm actually going to ask you to ask a question and then let the President Kerry answer it, please.
All right. They said, one of the people said that they thought they had something there, and she said, it's up to the people who are demonstrating, it's not up to them to come up with any different theory or different understanding of the process of globalization as to present the challenge. It's up to those within the system itself to come up to changes or alterations in terms of the basic structure by which globalization is going to be carried out that is more equitable. And the question is, are there need for more equitable understanding of processes by which the globalization at an economic level would take place to undercut the tendency of populist movements around the world who say the masses of the world are not and will not be served under the context by which globalization is benefiting the advantaged.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
No, the
the
content of what the change is.
No. Let.
You seek efficiency, I give it to you. Yes.
No?
Yeah,
All right.
I mean, the answer is emphatically yes. The WTO is in need of significant reform to open up its processes. The IMF, the World Bank. Yeah, there's no shortage of examples that one could give that says that unless we either fundamentally reform some of these multinational institutions, multilateral institutions, or create new institutions to do the things they cannot do, that globalism will continue to widen the gap between the have and have-nots, especially as a result of the in my view, the difficulties there. If you're in a nation, you're trying to build your nation, and your income is already very low, both the biological and the digital revolution tend to accelerate that widening. So
Exactly, yeah.
But at the same time, macroeconomic policies are tough.
Yeah.
I remember we give an honorary degree. You done?
No?
You gotta be. I got other people. Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, there's a
We
great
talk
deal that can be
afterwards. You and I,
talked
we'll
about.
talk afterwards.
Please.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is John Kim. I'm a member of the Veterans for Peace. I served in the U.S. Army, and I have a similar background like you. And first of all, I would like to thank for your support for ICC. That's, I think, a very responsible position to take as a leader. On the other hand, I'm not happy the way you handled the controversy surrounding your participation in the killing of the Vietnamese civilians during the Vietnam War. When that issue came out public, I think you didn't come out strongly or publicly that you never offered any public apology to the Vietnamese victims, and you never returned your medal you received for your participation in that operation. And I'm not sure whether that really is a responsible position that you should take in that case. Since this conference deals with the issue of war crimes and the Geneva Convention and the all that, so I thought maybe I would like to hear your comment on your position at this point, whether your conduct operation that you undertook as a Navy SEAL in that village in Vietnam constituted the state terrorism.
No, I don't think it did. I've never attempted to justify it morally or militarily. And I have offered my apologies to the people of Vietnam, and I've worked very hard all the way through the 1990s to end the trading with the Enemy Act restrictions, to restore normal trade relations and normal diplomatic relations with Vietnam. Worked with President Bush and then with President Clinton to get that done. And I don't know if I can say anything more than that on the subject. I mean, people say I haven't done enough, and I'm afraid all I can do is say that I am trying to do as much as I can to, not just do some good things in the world that make me feel like I've got some possibility for redemption, but to continue to deal as honestly as I know, not only with what I did, but honestly as I know, to make certain that the United States of America does the things necessary to make certain that that sort of thing doesn't happen. I don't know if I can do any more than that.
Jean Gardner, Parsons School of Design. I want to thank you for your very pragmatic approach in an academic community where experience isn't always the teacher. For instance, military should learn more about the rules of war because there are consequences. And what I want to talk about is ask you about is the consequences of more liberal trade laws. I think that it really is important to understand that trade as we practice it and as we exemplify it to the rest of the world has tremendously life-threatening consequences. Climate change, for instance. So that to continue advocating trade as a method of introducing democracy, for instance, to the rest of the world is confusing freedom with consumerism. The way we trade is using up the Earth's resources. The rest of the world cannot trade in this way, and I think it's morally irresponsible for us not to ourselves change our patterns and lead the way for the rest of the world. So I'm curious what, in a more elaborate way, you define this more liberal trade laws.
Well, very specifically, I mean, trade is nothing more and less than one person's got something to sell and the other person's got something to buy, wants to buy. And we still have a substantial amount of protection to protect what are basically our sort of pre-developed industries, you know, producing commodities, for example. And I guarantee you, you say, well, you know, shrug your shoulders and say it's awful. But if you're trying to grow corn in Uganda, or you're trying to establish an economy and build that economy, you don't say, you know what I think I'll do? I think I'll get into biotech. We get into biotech. We produce jobs that pay $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $80,000 a year. That's the kind of economy. We're a fully developed economy. We have universities throughout the United States of America that are magnets for the rest of the world. We've got an educational system that costs somewhere, K through 12, that costs somewhere between $6,000 and $10,000 a year. Now, New York City, $10,000 a year per kid. Nigeria's got less than $10 per capita to spend on education. Less than $10 per capita to spend on health. We're going to sit here and say, you can't sell us your corn? You can't sell us your textiles? You know, why don't you start manufacturing automobiles first? It doesn't work. Just doesn't work. I mean, I'm not only am I not an advocate of sort of blind trade, I favor aggressive conservation of resources. I favor increasing CAFE standards. I think it's obscene how much oil that we consume. We consume 20 billion barrels, 75 billion barrels that are produced in the world every single day. I mean, we use huge quantities of resources because of the convenience. We don't want to pay any higher prices. So I mean, I favor all that conservation. I favor protection of wilderness, and I oppose the opening up of ANWR. And I mean, I understand that you have to have development that's sustainable. I've supported the Kyoto Treaty. I'm telling you, if you're in a developing world, and we got 2 billion people on this planet earning less than $2 a day, we're sitting up here and say, well, no, you can't. You know, we're not going to let you sell us sugar. That's what we do. You can't sell us cotton. We're going to protect our basic industries. Fine. There isn't enough aid in the world. There isn't a military army big enough that's going to be able to solve the problem of a country trying to develop itself. If the European Union, the United States of America say, we're just going to, well, I know it's not right, I know it's not good, but I'm going to put a tariff on every damn thing that you sell here that we're not competitive in. Just doesn't work. And it's, in my view, if you visit those developing countries and see what they're trying to do and visit with the families that are trying to make ends meet, and you understand the consequences, not just that they can't sell here, but how about go to the WTO and they got a dispute with us? You know, we hire lawyers at $500 an hour. You know, more than the annual income of some of the countries that are trying to file a dispute against us. The WTO, the deck is stacked against them. So, yeah, I in that fundamental way, I favor liberalization of our trade laws. That's how the United States of America got where it is today, and I think we got to do it.
Just one quick thing. I'd ask no one else to get in line because we're not even certain we'll get to everyone. We do have to conclude on time. Please.
Good evening. My question has to do with many of the issues that have been discussed or mentioned tonight. It particularly involves the gentleman who served at Nuremberg, and also particularly involves the gentleman back of me who asked the question about the incident in the village. And the question is I'm going to phrase it in a second, but the question has to do with the commercial interest, or what I would call the profiteering interest between the American military and American actions overseas through the government. The lines between the military and commerce, what we call corporatism these days, are not very clear because they go through the White House and Congress. Now, this is connected to Nuremberg and Vietnam because of a very interesting, we call scapegoat. The decision you made, Lieutenant Kerry, that night in the village, or the decision that Kerry made to give that order at My Lai, and by the way, My Lai was one of hundreds, and I'm not exaggerating. They were all covered up. The only reason My Lai was exposed because the helicopter pilot had the courage to show his photos. So there were many My Lais. And I know that specifically because I'm a former Plans and Operations Officer with the Central Intelligence Agency in Vietnam, 1967-68. And before that, I'm a former detective with the Special Frauds Bureau of the New York City Police Department. So I have 40 years of dealing with corporations and crime and government. Now, the question I want to say is this.
Well, I'm glad I'm meeting you for the first time this evening.
Well, I've directed SEAL operations. I've went out with SEALs. I've dived on sunken North Vietnamese trawlers supposedly full of North Vietnamese arms and ammunition, etc. So all set up by the CIA. In any event, that's another story.
No,
So
we will get to your question because we're going to close down very quickly, I'm afraid.
Not in the middle of the question, will you?
What? No, please ask so we can answer the question.
All right. The question has to do with the business of commerce. A number of things were said tonight. When you go down, we can go back to General Smedley Darlington Butler, the most decorated man in American history in the 1930s, who complained and resigned, saying that he's been a mafia for corporate capitalism. We can go into some comments what Mussolini said about fascism and corporatism being the same thing. We can go into then Goring having said that people don't want to get into war, as was mentioned earlier. Yes, I understand. And yes, I am. The question, yes, certain questions you can't ask without certain prefacing remarks. The question is the connections with corporatism and the military. In Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam, my last assignment was the biggest depot in tonnage and dollar value port in the history of the world. The goods going through there were just mind-boggling. So there's a connection there. And the question I want to mention is that the people like yourself and Kerry, who had to make those responsible decisions in a village in the middle of the night, were blamed for things, but the real problem was the fact of the entire institution pushing the sale and the promotion of war as a commercial means to enhance the power and riches of the United States. And I was wondering, I haven't seen that issue addressed in the conference to date. Dr. Mack may want to respond to it, and I haven't seen it addressed here at all. So
Sir, the question is actually now asked. So
the question, yeah, that's what I'd like to know is that
no,
this
let us
connection,
answer the question. Right.
the connection between what you see between the military and the commercial interests that have driven over 230 American interventions.
Sir, we actually have the question now. I promise you, everyone in the audience knows your question.
I think you're right.
No, there's we understand the question.
Well, the 230 American interventions in foreign lands since 1776.
I'm really sorry. You're being quite unfair to the audience, and the other question asks. We understand your question. The president is actually learns very quickly, and he got the question a long time ago. I'd like him to answer it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I was interrupted so much I couldn't phrase the question properly.
No, I think I got. I mean, no, I think you know there's a tendency to want to rationalize bad behavior by blaming on somebody else. I don't think it's a good thing to do. So I don't accept the excuse. I also, you know, I accept what you're saying about the influence of and the connection between you know, defense industry and political decision making, but that's pretty broad-based. I'm sad to report to a grateful nation that money influences too many congressional decisions, too many presidential decisions, votes and administrative decisions. And though I think McCain-Feingold is going to help a bit, it'd be far better if we just publicly financed campaigns and took the money out altogether. It's just not going to change until we do. And I mean, I can give more examples of that. Money tends to corrupt, and it corrupts in politics, and it corrupts not in politics. You know, you say, you know, okay, I'm going to trim a little bit here because it's my job, or I'll trim it a little bit here because there's some money in it from me, or something. I'll trim a little bit because I'm afraid if I don't get the money for that television buy, I'm not going to be able to survive my campaign. It's a problem, but a deeper problem in democracy. And I tried to allude to it. I wasn't quite as specific, and I trust nowhere near as eloquent as I'd like to be on the subject matter. The far more difficult thing in democracy is that human beings don't like to be disliked. And oftentimes the right choice is a choice that causes you to be disliked. I don't know if you've anybody's had a chance to begin reading Robert Carroll's new book called Master of the Senate. It's on Lyndon Johnson. It's a terrific book. It's also 400 pages shorter than War and Peace, so it's definitely summer reading. But he tells some wonderful stories early on, and one on this that are on this point. And perhaps the most relevant one was, or most dramatic one, was the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Overwhelming support in the United States of America to do it. The radical Republicans controlled Congress, and they were ramming civil rights legislation through one after another. And Johnson was, by the way, the only Southerners to remain in the Congress when the Southern states seceded from the Union, and he became president. And they impeached him, impeached him because he had different views than the Congress did. That's what the basis of it. But it went big in the House, and everybody predicted it would go big in the Senate. And 11 Republicans voted no on impeachment. 11, and we didn't impeach Andrew Johnson. And in my view, and I think any honest evaluation of it, not only was the power of the presidency preserved, but the nature of our democracy fundamentally preserved in a good way. All 11 of them lost their elections. They didn't just lose their election, they were hated, reviled, burned in effigy, unwelcome in their communities anymore. I mean, in politics, I don't know how many of you have ever been in politics. I mean, hell hath no fury about that, like somebody who believes that abortion should be illegal, or that guns should not be controlled, or that homosexuality is immoral. And I just picked 3 because I happen to be on the other side of all issues, and I faced angry mobs. And there's real hate. And if you cast a vote based on conscience against an audience that's against you, you lose friends over it. So that's the hardest thing in democracy. The hardest thing in democracy is standing up in an audience of people, all 100 of whom say yes, and you say no. Knowing that you're going to be booed. Knowing that you may be spat upon. Knowing that you certainly nobody's going to hire you after that speech. So, I mean, yes, I take the undue influence of corporate money, and I don't like to see military decisions being based upon money in the deal. I would not rationalize any bad behavior based upon that. And I'd say, from 16 years of experience in politics, that money isn't the most corrupting thing. My father was an orphan and raised in Chicago, Illinois, and every famous person in Chicago, he quoted back to me when I was growing up. And one of them was Clarence Darrow, who took on the case of Leopold and Loeb, I think it was 1926. 2 Jewish boys, wealthy kids, who had killed their cousin, Bobby Franks. Planned the perfect crime and got caught. Public opinion wanted them dead. And Darrow said, according to my father, he was offered to take the case, and his goal, they confessed the crime. He said, I almost didn't take the case because I was 68 years old and I had grown weary of standing on the thin and lonely line that separates the good from the most destructive force in America today, public opinion. And what was true then is true now. And it's, it's the hardest thing in life, and it's the hardest thing in democracy as well.
But you said democracy 4 or 5 times. Do you really think that we have a democracy?
Thank you very much, John. So we have to stop.
Mr. Kerry, do you really think we have a democracy controlling our military interventions over 230 times, or do we have a corporate oligarchy controlling our military interventions?
Well, we have a very imperfect democracy, and that gives corporate oligarchies a lot of power, and perhaps more power than individual citizens. But oftentimes, individual citizens give up their power because they presume they have none, or they just don't want to go through the hell. Jim and Sarah Brady went through a lot of hell. They broke with their president on gun control. They broke with it. That wasn't, the NRA advertises, the liberal corporate organizations are taking away your right to bear arms. They use your argument on gun control. Wasn't true at all. Had 2 people decided to change the law and have a reasonable waiting period before you could purchase a handgun, for God's sake. It wasn't like it was the most radical revolutionary thing in the world, but boy, if you're in my country, in NRA country, you go out west of the Missouri River where I used to live, and that's a radical proposition. And they took a lot of abuse for it. They got it done. Citizens give up power oftentimes because they just want to believe the worst. And it's unfortunate, but it happens.
My apologies to the other questions.
Could I ask a question?
Dean Pruitt. If President Kerry can speak about Leopold and Loeb when talking about economics relationship to military intervention, I think the people who waited in line should have a chance to ask him questions as well.
I apologize to you. I gave a commitment to be here from 6 o'clock to 7:30, and I've got a 8-year-old baby at home and a wife at home, and I'm going home to him. See you later.